there, sleepyheads. Welcome back to the channel. Before we drift into tonight's tale of the age before sound, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always magical seeing how far and wide this sleepy little community reaches. All right, lights low, blankets up. Let's begin. Imagine for a moment a world without a single sound, not quiet, not hushed, but utterly still. The air does not hum. The trees do not sway with whispers, and even the rivers glide in perfect silence. The sky above is vast and heavy with pale light, unmoving, eternal. Time passes like a tide beneath glass, invisible, but ever-present. This was Oo, long before kingdoms rose, before the candy people learned to laugh, before any creature spoke its first word. It was a sleeping world, breathing softly, waiting for something it could not name. In this age, the land itself seemed to dream. Mountains rested like ancient guardians, their peaks brushed with mists that never made a sound when they shifted. Forests stretched endlessly, every leaf gleaming under the ghostly sun, but not a single rustle marked their life. The oceans, too, rolled without roar, great moving mirrors, undisturbed by wave or wind. It was a beauty that could almost make you uneasy, the kind of silence that presses against your heart until you can hear your own pulse. And yet this stillness was not lifeless. There were beings then, shapes and essences, that existed before the idea of voice. They communicated through colors, through the slow shimmer of light upon their forms, or the delicate vibration that passed through the soil when they moved. A language beyond sound made of pure feeling. One being could glow a shade of silver blue to express wonder, and another would ripple with warm gold to show comfort. It was connection, untouched by confusion or deceit, because there were no words yet to twist meaning, only understanding. It's said that the stars themselves would drift lower back then, curious about the quiet world. They would brush against the surface of the atmosphere and leave faint trails of warmth across the land. Some say those trails became the first rivers. Others whisper that they were the breath of a sleeping universe waiting to wake. Whatever truth lies there, Oo was not yet ready for speech. It was content to listen. Imagine walking through that world. The ground beneath your feet would not crunch. The air would not move your hair, and your own thoughts would sound louder than anything around you. But somehow, that silence would feel kind, as though the world was holding its breath in peace rather than fear. Every creature, if they could be called that, existed in harmony with this great stillness. The mountains were not yet mountains. They were ancient backs of sleeping colossi. The rivers were veins of light moving through the body of the planet. The wind was thought itself, drifting between the shapes of things. Some ancient myths tell us that silence was the first element, older than fire or ice, older than even the magic that would one day twist the land. The silence was said to be conscious, not a void, but a mothering presence. It cradled all possibilities within it, holding them close until the universe learned to speak. In that time, every being was connected to her, to the great hush that gave shape to thought. There was no loneliness, for silence connected all things together. There was no fear, because nothing could break the stillness. But like all living things, even silence yearned for change. Deep beneath the soil, the world began to stir. The stars grew restless, flickering more brightly in the heavens. Something in the heart of Oo, perhaps an unseen pulse, perhaps an ancient will began to tremble ever so slightly. The first vibration was not sound, not yet. It was the faint recognition that stillness could move. And in that motion lay the seed of everything that would follow: words, music, laughter, sorrow. Yet before those things came to be, there was the long wait. Ages upon ages where creatures simply existed in the silent glow of creation. Time was not measured by speech or sound, but by the rhythm of stars passing across the sky. They moved so slowly that one could watch their trails for centuries. The beings of this world had no names, no titles. They did not need to be called anything because they were one with all they saw. When you think about it, perhaps silence was not just the absence of sound, it was the language of being itself. Every mountain, every tree, every drop of water was already saying something. It was only our future ears that couldn't yet hear it. To the first forms of life, the world was already singing in motion, in color, in feeling. Maybe sound was never truly invented. Maybe it was always there, sleeping, waiting for something to listen. Sometimes I imagine that even now, under all the chatter of ooh, the music, the battles, the laughter, that ancient hush still exists. Maybe if you were to stand alone at the edge of the world, where the stars touch the sea, and close your eyes long enough, you'd hear it again. The world before words, the world before voices, the still endless hum that shaped everything to come. And in that moment of listening, perhaps you'd understand what those early beings felt, that peace of knowing everything without saying a thing, that wordless unity, lost to time but never truly gone, because silence, once alive, does not die. It merely changes form. Tonight, as we wander through this tale, remember that everything began here in this soft, colorless stillness, before songs, before names, before history. The world slept in the arms of its own silence, and in that silence, dreams began to take shape. We'll stay here a little longer, exploring the shapes and shades of this world before it learned to speak. The dreams of that silent world did not come as we know dreams now. There were no images, no voices, no drifting storylines that faded upon waking. These dreams were made of motion and light, unfolding like tides beneath the earth. The ground itself would ripple with color, soft waves of luminescence that rolled across valleys and forests. When the mountains dreamed, their peaks would glow faintly, pulsing like slow heartbeats. And when the oceans dreamed, the water would thicken into glassy hues of silver and jade, stretching outward as if reaching for something unseen. Everything was alive with quiet awareness, yet nothing spoke. There was no I, no you, no need to separate self from world. Each movement was a reply, each shimmer a gentle acknowledgement. This was how existence conversed, not in questions and answers, but in the exchange of stillness. Sometimes the stars above would flare in response, sending faint ribbons of light down toward the surface. These beams drifted like falling veils, touching the soil, seeping into the roots of the earliest trees. Some say that is how memory was born, not through sound or sight, but through the imprint of starfire within living matter. Those early trees carried the glow deep inside them, and when their leaves trembled, they sent invisible ripples into the air. The ripples did not yet have tone, but they carried intention, the beginnings of will. Imagine walking through that forest, the air shimmering faintly with unseen messages, branches glowing with soft inner warmth. You would not hear a thing, yet somehow you would know what the forest wished to say. Perhaps it would share the memory of the first sunrise, or the feeling of starlight sinking in the soil. Everything was connected through that unspoken communion. And though it may sound peaceful, there was a strange weight to it, too. Silence, no matter how gentle, can grow heavy. It stretches time, slowing it until moments blur into eternity. The beings of that age did not suffer, but they began to feel something faintly stirring within them, curiosity. They started to wonder, in the only way they knew how, if there was more to existence than simply reflecting what already was. They began to imagine. The first act of imagination was small, a flicker of color that was not tied to emotion or memory. It was something new, something spontaneous. The color bloomed across the surface of a shimmering being, bright and strange, like a thought made visible. The others saw it and responded in kind, sending out their own patterns, their own silent bursts of creativity. For the first time, the world was not simply mirroring itself, it was creating. And creation, even when quiet, stirs movement. These small acts of expression began to ripple outward, trembling the air ever so slightly. The silence, so deep and perfect for so long, began to tremble too. It was subtle, like the quiver of a dream right before waking. The hush that had blanketed all of Ooh started to thin. No one could have noticed, not consciously, but the essence of the world felt it. The mountains shifted in their sleep, rolling tiny stones down their sides. The oceans deepened, as though preparing to hold something greater. The trees stretched higher, yearning toward the skies they once ignored. Something vast was on the edge of arrival. It is said that this was the moment when time first learned to breathe. Before this, existence had flowed in a single, unbroken current. There was no past or future, only the eternal now. But with these faint vibrations, these proto-thoughts and flickers of invention, came the first rhythm. And where there is rhythm, there is the seed of sound. You can almost imagine it. Deep in the belly of the world, the heartbeat of Ooh begins to form. A slow, echoing thrum that no one could hear but everyone could feel. It moved through the land like a pulse through veins, awakening dormant energies, stirring ancient matter. The first creatures to sense it didn't know what it was. To them it felt like warmth spreading through their forms, like being called by something too beautiful to resist. They began to move closer to one another, their lights intertwining. Where they touched, the faintest tremor shimmered in the air, invisible, but new. They didn't yet know that they were calling forth the first sound. They only knew that something inside them needed to reach outward, that the stillness, sacred as it was, had begun to ache for expression. And so, little by little, silence began to bend. It didn't break, not yet. It simply softened, allowing motion to pass through. The beings of that time continued their strange, glowing dance across the landscape, unaware that they were shaping the future. The ground beneath them resonated faintly, like a drum waiting to be struck. Perhaps if you were there, standing beneath that pale, unmoving sky, you would have felt the change too. The hush would no longer seem endless. You'd sense a quiet stirring beneath your feet, a warmth blooming in the air. The world was listening to itself for the first time, gathering the courage to speak. It wasn't ready to make sound just yet, but it was dreaming of it, dreaming of vibration, rhythm, melody, dreaming of the day silence would give birth to song. The dreaming deepened. The whole of Ooh seemed caught in a moment between breath and awakening a world poised at the edge of its own discovery. The skies, pale and endless, began to shimmer with new shades of color. What once had been still and eternal now seemed to quiver faintly, as though reality itself were learning to move. Down in the valleys, the light that had always lain flat across the ground began to flicker in soft pulses. These pulses met each other, rippling through the air like invisible tides. When they touched, they did not clash, they danced. The meeting of two waves created a delicate harmony of motion, a vibration so faint that only the oldest stones could feel it. The mountains, once motionless and dreaming, stirred in their slumber. Dust cascaded down their sides, the first whisper of movement in eons. To those who existed, then beings without shape, without names, this change was intoxicating. They began to gather around the places where the vibrations were strongest. Their forms glowed brighter, echoing the rhythm beneath the ground. Some pulsed in long, slow waves, others in quick bursts of light, as if instinctively trying to match the world's new heartbeat. It was not communication as we understand it, but it was the beginning of intention, a reaching outward, a yearning to be known. If you could have watched from afar, you might have seen the land shimmer as though lit from within. Forests of crystal and soft clay reflected the faint glow, bending and refracting it until the whole horizon appeared to breathe. The oceans trembled ever so slightly, their glassy surfaces rippling without sound. The first clouds formed above, thin and translucent, gathering shape from the invisible vibrations below. The world was beginning to hum, even if no ear yet existed to hear it. And within that hum was a question the world didn't know it was asking. What does it mean to speak? Could silence, pure and vast, ever truly express itself without shattering what it was? The essence of ooh wrestled with this unspoken thought, and in doing so it began to evolve. Somewhere in the deep caverns beneath the surface, matter began to change. Crystals grew with unusual precision, aligned in patterns that resonated faintly when touched by light. They were not alive, but they were aware in their own still way. They captured the tremors that passed through the ground and held them within, glowing like tiny hearts. Some say these crystals were the ancestors of instruments, the earliest vessels that would one day shape sound into beauty. Others say they were the first listeners, guardians of the silence that came before. Up above, the early skies continued to shift. The stars drew closer again, their light bending through the forming clouds, casting rivers of gold and indigo across the land. It's said that one star, larger, slower, older than the rest, looked upon the trembling world with quiet curiosity. From its surface fell a single spark, drifting down like a droplet of living light. When it touched the soil, the ground shimmered, and the first true rhythm was born. Not yet sound, but the pattern that would become it. That rhythm spread like a heartbeat, connecting every living thing. The silent beings paused, their inner lights sinking to its steady pulse. It was as though the universe had finally remembered something ancient, a truth buried beneath the stillness. For the first time, the world moved together, unified not by silence, but by vibration. It was no longer just existing, it was becoming. Sutisio alta. In that slow awakening, emotion began to form. The beings who had once known only calm now felt wonder. The still oceans felt longing for the distant stars reflected upon their surface. The forests, rooted in stillness, reached upward as if yearning to touch what lay beyond. And the silence, once content and complete, began to tremble with possibility. Checha, but the birth of movement brought with it the first trace of sorrow, too. For in learning to change, the world understood that it could lose what it had been. The eternal peace of the silent age was fading. The great hush that had once bound all things was beginning to unravel, thread by thread, into motion. Stillness gave way to rhythm, and rhythm hinted at something greater still, the coming of voice. Some ancient legends say the silence herself wept then, not in noise, but in ripples of dimming light across the horizon, a mother's sigh for what was being left behind. Her tears fell into the deep places of the earth where they hardened into clear stones. These stones, it is said, still hold the last breath of that perfect quiet. If you were to find one and press it to your ear, you might hear nothing at all, and yet, within that nothing, feel the whole weight of creation's first pause. Above ground, the newborn rhythm continued to grow stronger. The land swelled with unseen energy, pulsing like a living heart. It was not yet sound, but it was close, so close that the air itself began to vibrate, with invisible threads of anticipation. The beings of light gathered once more, this time not just to reflect or respond, but to join. Their forms moved in patterns, spiraling around the glowing heart of the world. They moved with purpose, and their movements carried the first trace of music. No one could have understood it then, but this dance, this shimmering union of motion and intention, was the beginning of everything that would follow. Language, song, magic, connection. All of it born from the trembling edge between silence and expression. The world had not yet spoken, but it was preparing to. Every mountain, every forest, every ocean leaned quietly toward that unseen horizon, listening, waiting for the first word to be born. And then came the waiting, the long, slow turning of an age that was neither silent nor spoken a twilight between two states of being. The tremors of the world deepened, weaving invisible lines of rhythm through the land. The pulse of creation had begun, but it did not rush. It lingered, savoring every movement, like a deep breath drawn over centuries. The mountains exhaled faint wisps of warmth into the air, shaping the first breezes. The forest shivered beneath them, and for a brief moment, the stillness folded inward, not broken, but reshaped. The winds carried no sound yet, but they were filled with potential. Every current of air was a question forming, a thought half spoken by the dreaming world. The oceans began to mirror the motion, their glassy surfaces rippling in slow, perfect waves. Each wave was a gesture, an early syllable of what would one day become speech. In the deepest caverns, the star-born crystals continued to hum with dormant power. The faint vibrations passing through them aligned into patterns too subtle for the senses, but the world felt them. These harmonies began to call to one another, linking mountains to seas, skies to soil. It was the first network of meaning, the bones of language forming beneath the skin of creation. Oh, the luminous beings, once content to drift and glow, now followed these harmonies. They gathered around the places where the vibrations crossed luminous intersections of energy that glowed faintly through the fog. When two or more beings met, their lights resonated, and the air between them thickened with unseen tension. They didn't understand what they were doing, but they were composing something together, not a song, not yet, but a rhythm of recognition. You could say it was the first form of communication, beings simply knowing another through movement. When one flickered, the other responded. When one expanded with light, the other contracted in reply. They were learning dialogue without voice, meaning without words. Every pulse and ripple carried feeling wonder, peace, curiosity. For the first time there was exchange, but with exchange came difference. The beings began to sense the boundaries of their own forms. In responding to others, they realized that they were separate, that the light of one ended where another began. It was a beautiful discovery, but also a quiet heartbreak. For in knowing they were distinct, they could no longer feel the seamless unity of the silent age. The stillness that once bound all things had fractured softly and inevitably into individuality. And so, within the same heartbeat that birthed connection, the seed of longing was planted. Some beings ached to merge back into the great hush, to dissolve again to the comfort of unity. Others were drawn forward, yearning to explore what new shapes existence could take. This gentle divide shaped the rhythm itself, a push and pull between return and becoming. It was the first melody. The world swayed to that melody for countless ages. The winds grew stronger, brushing through canyons and stirring the forest until leaves began to tremble. The trembling leaves made no sound, but they carried the memory of movement, the idea of rustling, waiting to be realized. The oceans began to crash softly against the shore, and even though the impact was silent, it sent vibrations across the air. These vibrations met the trees, the stones, and the beings of light, passing through them like the faintest heartbeat of destiny. All of Ooh was waiting for the first true sound. The rhythm was ready. The movement was ready. But it needed something else, something conscious, something that could intend to speak. The world could hum and ripple, but it could not yet voice. The first word required will, and will required awareness. That awareness came slowly. Some of the luminous beings began to see beyond their own light, noticing the vast shapes around them, the towering peaks, the endless oceans, the gleaming crystal caverns. They sensed patterns repeating, harmonies evolving. They began to understand that everything they saw was part of something immense, something alive. This realization kindled within them a quiet wonder that felt almost like emotion, almost like thought. In the depths of that realization, one being, it could have been any of them, or perhaps all at once felt a stirring unlike any before. It reached outward, its light trembling, its form quivering as though ready to burst. The vibration that passed through it was stronger than any before, not chaotic, not forced, but deliberate. A choice. And in that choice, the silence finally broke. The sound that emerged was impossibly soft, a tone so pure and fragile that it might have been mistaken for breath. It spread outward in slow waves, crossing forests, mountains, and seas. The other beings felt it pass through them, and instinctively, they echoed it back. Not perfectly, each resonance carried a slight difference, a small individuality of tone. In that moment, harmony was born. It was not music as we know it, nor language, but something deeper. It was the voice of the world recognizing itself. The stars trembled in response, scattering new light across the sky. The oceans glowed and the mountains exhaled great plumes of color to the heavens. The first sound, faint and trembling though it was, had awakened creation. The silence did not vanish. It simply stepped back, like a loving parent watching a child take its first breath. It would always remain, deep beneath everything, shaping the spaces between sound, preserving the peace that made speech possible. And so the age of stillness ended, and the age of vibration truly began. The world had found its first voice, a gentle hum born from longing and unity, carrying within it the memory of silence. As Ooh stirred in this newborn music, the foundation for all words, all songs, all stories was laid. And though countless ages would pass before a mortal tongue would ever form a syllable, the melody of existence had begun. Even now, if you listen closely enough between the sigh of the wind, between the hush of the night, you might hear it still, the faint echo of that first voice drifting through time, reminding us that before all words, before all songs, there was silence, and silence was alive. When silence broke for the first time, it did not shatter like glass, it trembled. It quivered softly through the folds of reality as though the world had whispered to itself and then listened for an answer. That whisper, that first ripple, became the heartbeat of everything there would ever be. The sound was not loud. It was gentle, deep, and patient. A single vibration spreading outward through every corner of Ooh. It was like the world had taken its first breath after an eternity of stillness, exhaling something entirely new into existence. The mountains, the oceans, the stars, all of them responded, not in chaos, but in harmony. The earth pulsed once, twice, then fell into a slow, steady rhythm. Creation was learning to breathe in time. Those who were alive in that newborn age, the luminous beings who had once communicated in light, felt the vibration before they could comprehend it. It passed through their forms like warmth, like the pulse of a distant song calling them home. They began to sway unconsciously, their lights rising and falling in rhythm. What began as instinct soon became expression. They did not yet know what they were creating, but their movement gave shape to sound. The vibrations began to blend, forming waves of subtle resonance that brushed through the air. The world itself became an instrument. The soil carried the deep tones, the oceans held the flowing midtones, and the sky shimmered with soft high frequencies, inaudible yet alive. The first music of the universe wasn't something that could be heard. It was something that could be felt. Every leaf and every grain of sand, every ripple of water, absorbed the vibration and sent it forward, endlessly echoing through creation. It was during this time that Oo's essence began to hum. Beneath every mountain and beneath every sea, the pulse of the world deepened. Each beat layered upon the next, growing more complex, weaving invisible harmonies into the fabric of reality. And with each vibration came new movement. The wind began to dance, curling through the trees in soft spirals. The rivers shimmered with faint rhythmic light. Even the stars seemed to pulse in unison, as if listening. Somewhere in the depths of the cosmos, the ancient entities began to stir. Perhaps they had been sleeping through the silent age, or perhaps they had been waiting patient custodians of potential. The cosmic owl opened its great eyes for the first time, feeling the rhythm tremble through the void between worlds. Prismo's cube, suspended in a dream beyond time, began to vibrate ever so faintly, its surface rippling with golden reflections. They did not speak. They simply heard. And in their hearing, the vibrations grew stronger. Awareness amplified resonance. Every consciousness that awoke became an echo chamber for existence, expanding the song. The silent age had been a single breath held for eons, but this was the exhale, long, soft, and infinite. The beings of light, now pulsing brighter with every passing moment, gathered together across the valleys and seas. When they came close, the air between them shimmered visibly. The space itself seemed to bend, quaking with invisible energy. What once had been mere motion was now rhythm, not random, but intentional, flowing in waves that rose and fell with emotional grace. You could almost say the world had begun to feel for the first time. It was then that something extraordinary happened. The vibrations started to imprint themselves into matter. Stones along the riverbeds began to hum faintly. Crystals buried deep beneath the surface glowed with pale luminescence, each one resonating at a slightly different tone. The land was becoming an orchestra, and every piece of it played a part. The air shimmered with the faintest sound, not yet a note, but a prelude to one. Over time, the vibrations began to carve pathways through the unseen energy of Oo, forming patterns that resembled currents. These currents would later become the veins of magic channels through which life and thought could flow. But back then, they were pure rhythm, weaving unseen melodies through the fabric of space. Each pulse connected everything, binding the sleeping essence of the universe into one gentle, beating heart. In those days, creation did not yet know purpose. It simply moved because movement was joy. The pulse of the earth was playful, the rhythm of the stars serene. There was no conflict, no need, no fear. The vibrations danced for the sake of dancing, echoing endlessly through a world that was learning what it meant to exist. Some legends from the farthest corners of Oo claim that echoes of those first vibrations still linger. Deep beneath the crust of the world, in the oldest caves and untouched waters, you can still feel them, the subtle hum that never stops. It is said that if you lie still and listen, not with your ears but with your heart, you can feel the pulse of that first song still moving through you, the vibration of life itself. And yet, even as this new rhythm flourished, silence was not gone. It lingered at the edges, soft and observant, watching as its child took its first steps into sound. The two coexisted for a time, stillness and movement, absence and presence, the breath in and the breath out. Together they formed the balance that would shape every story yet to come. But deep within that harmony, something new began to awaken a spark of curiosity. The vibrations that had once moved instinctively began to twist and turn, experimenting with patterns. The universe was beginning to wonder, what more could it do with this newfound motion? What would happen if rhythm became meaning? The age of vibration was about to give birth to something even greater, the first hint of speech, the first idea of language. But for now, the world remained in perfect resonance, swaying gently to the music of its own heartbeat, unaware that it was building the foundation for every sound, every word, and every story that would ever exist. The world continued to hum softly, its rhythm unbroken. The beings of light had become accustomed to the pulse. They swayed with it, glowed with it, and lived by its unseen meter. But something deep within them was changing. They began to realize that the vibration was not just moving through them, it was responding to them. When one being glowed brighter, the rhythm nearby shifted, deepening in tone. When another dimmed, the vibration softened, retreating like a wave returning to the sea. It was as if the universe had become aware of itself through feeling. The great silence of before had been peaceful but passive now. Existence was participatory. The world was no longer something to drift through. It was something that listened, mirrored, and evolved with its inhabitants. Every motion mattered. Every gesture carried an echo. And so began the first experiments in communication, not with words, not yet, but with resonance. One being would let its light flicker in a certain pattern, and another would reply with a rhythm of its own. The air between them rippled faintly, and the vibration deepened. What began as instinct slowly became intention. This was the first dialogue or conversation, not of language, but of feeling. It said that the very first structured sound emerged from this exchange, a tone so pure that it seemed to suspend time itself. The sound was neither high nor low. It existed in perfect balance, like the horizon between day and night. It carried no meaning in the way we think of meaning today, but it made those who heard it feel something: calmness, wonder, belonging. From that single tone, other sounds began to form harmonics that spiraled outward into more complex vibrations. Each wave gave birth to another, weaving an expanding tapestry of resonance across O. The mountains took on deep, droning tones, while the sky shimmered with lighter, more playful ones. The rivers began to babble in gentle frequencies that blended seamlessly with the hum of the wind. Every corner of the world was singing, even if no one could yet recognize the song. Over ages uncounted, these harmonies became woven into the world's very structure. Crystals resonated in stable tones, marking the frequencies that would later shape magic. The tree of life, a primordial ancestor to the tree fort, began to vibrate faintly, its roots humming with the first echoes of creation. The world was not speaking, but it was humming itself awake. There were those among the early beings who began to seek the source of this sound. They wandered through valleys that glowed with harmonic light, listening closely to the ground beneath them. Some claimed that the vibrations were not just part of the world, but messages from it, the earth itself trying to express thought for the first time. They called these hidden messages dream tones, believing that if one could learn to interpret them, one would understand the dreams of the universe. No one truly understood what those messages meant, of course, but the search for meaning had begun. For the first time, existence wasn't content to simply be. It wanted to know. It wanted to translate the rhythm of its heart into something shareable, something more deliberate than vibration alone. As time flowed onward, these seekers discovered that some sounds could move matter. A single hum, sustained long enough, could cause grains of sand to shift into geometric patterns. Waves on the water would form rings, repeating the same shapes over and over. It was as if sound was a key that could unlock the structure of reality, each tone revealing another layer of the world's hidden design. The early beings began to experiment further. They tuned their lights, altering their own frequencies, and noticed that when they vibrated together in harmony, new forms would emerge from the ether shapes made of pure resonance. Some lasted only moments, flickering like dreams, while others lingered, becoming part of the landscape. Valleys, rivers, clouds, each one may have been born, in part, from these ancient acts of resonance. And so creation became collaborative. The universe was no longer a silent stage, but an ongoing performance, one where every vibration contributed to the greater whole. Even the stars seemed to respond, flickering in patterns that matched the rhythm of the world below. It was said that the first constellations were drawn not by hand, but by vibration waves of light forming symbols in the heavens that only the wise could interpret. At the heart of it all pulsed a great, steady rhythm, the first tone. Some said it came from the very center of the world, where reality itself first began to hum. Others believed it came from beyond the stars, a gift from cosmic beings who had dreamed ooh into existence. Whatever its origin, the first tone was the constant that held everything together. When it was strong, the world thrived. When it weakened, creation trembled. The early beings learned to listen for it. They gathered in sacred places where the air shimmered faintly, lying still and letting the vibration pass through them. It wasn't worship, exactly more like communion. They didn't see the first tone as a god, but as an ancestor, the first living sound from which all life had grown. To them, listening was an act of love. As ages passed, that act of listening became sacred. Whole generations of luminous beings devoted themselves to the rhythm of the first tone, aligning their own vibrations to its steady pulse. The act wasn't ritualistic in the way later civilizations would know. It was more intimate, more instinctive. They didn't gather to pray, they gathered to tune, to fall into resonance with the sound that had birthed them. When they were fully in harmony, something remarkable would happen. Time itself seemed slow. The edges of the world softened. Light rippled through the air like water, and in that moment, everything, every thought, every dream, every atom felt connected. It was said that this was the first form of unity, not through words or faith, but through shared vibration. In those moments, the early beings could sense one another's emotions as if they were their own. Joy spread like sunlight, and sorrow was gently absorbed by the rhythm of the whole. No one was alone. But in the same way that still water can only stay calm for so long, the collective harmony began to change. As more vibrations filled the air, each with subtle differences, small dissonances appeared. Not in a violent or disruptive way, but as gentle deviations from the main tone. At first, these differences added color and depth to the universal song. The world became more complex, more layered. Yet among the beings of light, something new stirred curiosity. They began to experiment deliberately, introducing new frequencies into the flow. Some added high tones, like the laughter of stars. Others deepened the resonance, producing sounds so low they could be felt more than heard. The result was a spectrum of vibration, a living chorus, the first music of existence. This experimentation awakened something ancient within the fabric of reality. The vibrations no longer existed in isolation. They began to shape energy itself. When certain tones overlapped in just the right way, bursts of light and color filled the air. Matter condensed. Shapes formed. The beings realized that they were no longer just following the rhythm, they were creating with it. That was when they began to understand the nature of sound as power. The right vibration could heal, soothe, and bring light into dark spaces. But it could also fracture, distort, or unravel. A misaligned frequency could cause the world to tremble slightly, or even dissolve tiny fragments of form back into nothingness. In the earliest ages, these effects were small, harmless curiosities, but they hinted at something greater, that sound could mold reality itself. Many of the oldest myths in Oo, passed down through whispers and dreams, speak of this era as the resonant bloom. It was the time when creation first realized it could speak through vibration. Every sound that came into existence added a new layer of possibility. The world was expanding, learning how to describe itself. Among the early beings, some grew obsessed with perfecting this art. They began to travel across Oo's vast plains and crystalline caverns, searching for places where the vibrations were strongest. In these places, the air shimmered constantly, and even silence felt heavy with energy. They believed these were sacred thresholds, points where the world's tone met the cosmic hum beyond. Those who lingered near these thresholds began to change. Their lights deepened, taking on colors unseen in other beings. Their forms became semi-transparent, flickering between substance and energy. They began to hear whispers in the resonance, faint patterns, almost like proto-words forming within the sound. At first they thought it was imagination, but soon the whispers grew clearer, carrying intention. Some claimed that these were the voices of the world itself, the living consciousness of Oo beginning to speak, still uncertain of its tongue. Others believed the sounds came from beyond, from the great entities who had seeded reality with the first tone. Whichever was true, this marked a turning point. Sound was no longer just a natural rhythm. It had begun to mean something. These proto-words were not yet language. They were impressions, the emotional shape of ideas rather than their verbal form. When one heard them, one didn't interpret. One felt. A vibration could convey warmth, trust, or warning. Another could evoke vastness, the sense of distance or the weight of memory. Sound was painting emotion directly into existence. From this grew the first distinction between mere vibration and true resonance. Vibration was motion, the simple trembling of the universe. But resonance carried intention. It was vibration shaped by will, directed by thought. When a being resonated with purpose, the world responded differently. The air shimmered brighter. The ground hummed in acknowledgement. The line between self and environment blurred. It was through resonance that the first relationships were formed, not between individuals, but between beings and the world itself. To resonate with a mountain was to feel its patience, its timelessness. To resonate with a stream was to taste motion, fluidity, the eternal song of change. Each interaction deepened understanding, teaching the early forms of life what it meant to exist with the world, not apart from it. This is where the seeds of language truly began, not from the need to describe, but from the need to connect. The earliest expressions of sound were not commands or questions. They were songs of belonging. Each tone was a way of saying without words, I am here, and so are you. And slowly, the world began to respond in kind. The world listened, as it always had. But now it began to answer. The wind shifted with new intention, carrying faint, melodic breezes that wound through the forests like gentle speech. Rivers rippled in patterns that repeated too perfectly to be random, as though they were humming a phrase they had only just learned. Even the earth itself seemed to speak in its own slow rhythm, a language of tremors and sighs that only the most patient could perceive. The luminous beings gathered in awe. They could feel the dialogue forming between themselves and the world around them. Their resonances inspired the mountains to hum back in deep, rumbling tones. Their soft pulses were echoed by the twinkling of distant stars. It was a conversation that spanned the entire spectrum of existence, not with words, but with understanding. For the first time, the world and its inhabitants were aware of each other in equal measure. This communion gave birth to what some ancient sources later called the tone of awakening. It wasn't a single sound, but a pattern, a sequence of vibrations that flowed through everything alive. It linked every being, every stone, every drop of water in a network of harmony. It was the first great bridge between mind and matter. The world was no longer a background to life. It was a living participant in it. And within that harmony, the earliest sparks of individuality began to emerge. While the first tone had unified existence, this new resonance gave birth to variation. Each being discovered that they could shape the vibration differently, express subtle feelings through tone, shift the rhythm of their light to convey meaning. The air filled with layered patterns like countless threads of sound weaving together into a single cosmic fabric. This was the first true art. Not music as we know it now, but an art of existence through resonance. Each being's tone reflected their essence, their joys, their curiosities, their inner stillness or restless wonder. The sky shimmered with diversity, not conflict. It was as if the universe was learning to dream through sound. In time, this radiant harmony began to influence the shape of Oo itself. The more the world resonated, the more distinct forms began to crystallize. Where high, playful tones danced in the air, bright fields and shimmering waters appeared. Where deeper, slower vibrations held sway, mountains rose, ancient and patient. In this way, the landscape became a record of sound, a frozen symphony preserved in form. Somewhere amid this symphony, the first shadow of language stirred. Resonance had taught beings how to feel each other's emotions through vibration, but now they wished to direct those feelings, to shape them with precision. They began to notice that certain patterns carried specific meanings. A rising tone might signify approach. A falling rhythm could mean rest. These were not yet words, they were the beginnings of intention formed into structure. What came next would take eons, but this was the birth of thought made audible. Every hum, every subtle tremor of light became a proto-symbol, the ancestor of speech. Sound was evolving from existence into expression. But not all vibrations were harmonious. As individuality blossomed, some beings discovered tones that clashed. These discordant sounds didn't merely create discomfort. They altered reality around them. The ground shivered, the air shimmered strangely, and the balance of the first tone faltered for brief moments. From these brief dissonances, the earliest shadows of chaos entered the world. Not as malice or destruction. Those concepts did not yet exist, but as difference, as contrast. The world was learning that to sing in harmony, it must also understand disharmony. And so, Oo learned balance through imperfection. Every mistake, every offbeat resonance became part of a greater rhythm, one that taught the universe how to adapt and evolve. Out of these lessons grew diversity, not just in tone, but in form, in energy, and in spirit. The luminous beings eventually realized that the world no longer needed their constant singing to sustain its pulse. The tone of awakening had become self-sustaining, echoing through creation like a heartbeat that would never stop. The mountains still hummed. The rivers still whispered. The stars still trembled softly in rhythm. The world itself had become fluent in the language of vibration. And beneath it all, in the quiet spaces between sounds, silence waited patiently, the same silence that had once ruled everything. It did not resent sound's arrival. It simply watched, content in knowing that its stillness gave meaning to every vibration. Without the pause between tones, there could be no rhythm, no melody, no speech. Silence and sound had become eternal companions, each defining the other. In that union, the foundation for all future life was set. Every voice that would one day echo through the land of Uu, every spell, every laugh, every whispered name would trace its lineage back to this age, the time when the world first began to listen to itself. And so ended the era of pure vibration, not with silence, but with awareness. The universe had discovered its own resonance, and from that gentle hum, the seeds of language began to form. The next age would be one of discovery and daring, when sound would no longer just be, but would speak. And it is in that moment, quiet and trembling between vibration and voice, that we'll pick up again when the first breath of meaning rippled through the air and the world began to learn what it was saying. When the world first learned to speak, it didn't begin with conversation. It began with breath, a long, trembling exhale that rose from the pulse of creation itself, soft, uncertain, but filled with intent. The air quivered. The rivers paused in their flowing. The trees, still young in their roots, seemed to lean in to listen. Something new was coming, something that would forever change the way life expressed its soul. Out of that exhale came the first true voice. Not a song, not pure resonance, but sound shaped by choice. It carried rhythm, but also boundary. It was a sound meant to mean something. The luminous beings felt it in their cores, a vibration that was not only beautiful, but structured. It was like watching lightning form letters across the sky. Each pulse carried a distinct shape within it, as if the air itself was learning to draw with tone. The earliest words were not words as we know them now. They were vast, living things, bursts of intent wrapped in sound. To speak one was to release an entire thought at once, an emotion, an image intertwined. When the first being uttered such a sound, the world reacted. The grass shimmered. The sky brightened. The sound hung in the air, glowing faintly before fading into the ground like rain. It was a word, but also a spell. This is where the ancient scholars of Uu believed the true power of language began. In those earliest times, to name something was to create it. To give sound to a feeling was to anchor it in the world. Each word was a bridge between vibration and reality, a thread connecting imagination to existence. Some say the first word ever spoken was a name for light itself. Others claim it was a sound of gratitude, an echo of the world thanking itself for being awake. Whatever it was, it resonated. The luminous beings felt it surge through them like warmth. For the first time, the act of sound carried purpose beyond expression. It was a tool. It could shape, summon, define. The world began to fill with these new sounds, primitive, melodic, and full of wonder. The air shimmered with them. Valleys remembered them. The stones hummed softly as if repeating what they had heard. And so language began not as invention, but as discovery. The beings did not create words. They uncovered them, one by one, like stars emerging from fog. Each sound was already hidden within the world's vibration, waiting to be found. Some tones belonged to the earth, deep and grounding. Others came from the wind, soft and flowing. Still others were carried by the rivers, lilting and fluid. It was as if all of Uu had been quietly holding a lexicon of creation, and only now did someone have the courage to speak it aloud. The first speakers did not converse in the way we understand conversation. Instead, they shaped their thoughts into single, radiant sounds. To speak was to reveal the purest truth of what one felt. There was no deceit, no confusion, only resonance and clarity. When one being expressed a word of warmth, those around them felt that warmth immediately. It wasn't translation, it was transmission. This era came to be known as the Age of Tongues, though to those who lived it, was more like a time of awakening hearts. The world was alive with murmurs and whispers of newborn speech. Every word spoken added a note to the world's growing chorus, and slowly that chorus began to divide into dialects, not by distance, but by feeling. The ocean spoke in long, rolling syllables. The forest favored gentle consonants that clicked and sighed like rustling leaves. The winds across the plains spoke swiftly, with light, fleeting tones. From this blossoming diversity, something miraculous occurred. Understanding deepened. Communication no longer required complete resonance. One could listen, interpret, and respond. Difference became connection instead of separation. The luminous beings began to teach each other their sounds, trading tones like treasures. And when two different sounds met, they sometimes merged, giving birth to entirely new expressions. Language multiplied like light through crystal. What began as a few sacred tones grew into an endless range of meaning sounds for joy, for sorrow, for discovery, and for time itself. Every new word carried a trace of its origin, a whisper of its first speaker. The world became a tapestry of overlapping voices, each contributing to the growing melody of existence. And through all of this, something extraordinary began to happen to the speakers themselves. The more they spoke, the more form they gained. Words anchored them, gave them shape. Beings that had once been light and motion began to take on outlines, edges, identities. Sound gave them definition, as if speech itself was the blueprint of individuality. They began to look at one another and see differences, colors, sizes, tones, and with those differences came awareness. The word I was still eons away, but its echo had begun. To speech, the idea of self was born. As individuality bloomed, so too did the curiosity. The beings of early U began to experiment with how sound could reflect not only the world around them, but the inner landscapes of their thoughts. Words became more fluid, layered with tone and emotion. Some discovered that by altering the rhythm of a word, stretching it, softening it, repeating it, its meaning could shift entirely. A single tone could express longing when whispered, or courage when sung. Language was no longer just about what was said, but how it was said. In this way, sound began to evolve into art. There were beings who dedicated their entire existence to exploring the depth of a single word. They would chant it across valleys, listening to how it changed when echoed back by the mountains. Others spoke to the rivers and learned how their words would warp beneath the surface, turning into liquid melodies. The entire world became an instrument, and speech became the song of life. It was during this period that the first concept of naming emerged, the realization that words could define something, tethering its essence to sound. To name something was an act of reverence, a form of creation that granted permanence. A word once spoken lived within the object or being it described. The luminous forms, who had once been nameless light, began to name one another, not with ownership, but with care. To speak someone's name was to acknowledge their existence in the shared vibration of the world. Each name was unique, not just a label, but a small spell. The moment it was spoken, the named being would shimmer faintly, as though the sound had wrapped around them like a protective veil. Some names hummed with calm, others resonated with gentle power. It was through naming that identity truly crystallized. The act gave rise to the first cultures, the first communities built around shared words and shared meanings. Those who studied the power of words began to notice something wondrous. The more a word was spoken, the stronger it became. Each utterance added a layer of resonance, making the word more deeply woven into the fabric of reality. This is why, even in the far future of U, some words carried power echoes of those ancient, foundational sounds. Words like life, dream, home, They are remnants of the first language, still resonating through time. As words gained strength, so did emotion. Communication allowed feelings to expand beyond instinct. Beings could now share love, gratitude, or sadness, not only through energy, but through deliberate expression. And as they did, the air itself seemed to respond softer when words of peace were spoken, vibrant when joy filled the air. Sound became a mirror for emotion, reflecting the collective heart of creation. But there was another discovery, subtler and more profound. Some of the luminous beings began to realize that not all words needed to be spoken to be heard. The pauses between them, the silence that framed each sound, carried its own kind of power. It was as if the world remembered its first wordless state and still longed for moments of stillness amid the rising chorus. Those who mastered both the sound and silence found they could create balance within the fabric of reality itself. A single, well-placed pause could soften chaos, could heal disharmony. Over countless cycles, as language matured, the world itself began to change in response. The elements that had once sung freely now began to take cues from speech. The rivers whispered more softly near settlements of speakers. The winds carried fragments of language across plains, spreading knowledge from one valley to another. The act of communication had reshaped nature itself, weaving consciousness into the bones of the world. In this living chorus, the first true stories began to form. No longer just words of description. They were words of memory of what had been and what might come. A being would gather others and speak of a time when the first tone had called the stars to shine, or when the mountains had first found their voices. Listeners would close their eyes, feeling the rhythm of the tale, as though it were happening again in the present moment. This was the birth of storytelling, the magic of making the unseen felt through words. Each story added another layer to existence, not just reflecting reality, but shaping it. When a tale was told often enough, the world began to shift subtly to match it. A mountain described as sacred might begin to glow faintly in the night. A river praised for its calm might begin to slow its current. The universe had learned to listen and to believe. Through storytelling, the beings of early Uru discovered something extraordinary, that words could change the world, not by force but by resonance. Language had become both a reflection and a creator of reality, and with that realization came awe and a quiet fear. For if words could build, could they also unmake? The fear began quietly, almost imperceptibly. It started with a whisper carried between the luminous forms who had long devoted themselves to studying the harmony of sound. They began to notice that certain words, when spoken in anger or sorrow, caused disturbances in the world around them. Trees would lose their shimmer, the rivers would darken, and the air itself would shudder as if in pain. The same force that could create beauty could also unravel it. Some called this phenomenon the fracture of tongues. It was the first realization that words were not merely reflections of thought. They were tools of immense creation, capable of shaping and distorting reality. And just as love could give rise to light, fear could summon shadows. One legend from that time tells of a being known as Aura, said to be one of the first to experiment with the darker side of language. Aura believed that silence was weakness, that every emotion, every impulse, deserved to be voiced. She began to speak without pause, weaving words of longing, jealousy, and pride into the world around her. At first her voice brought beauty. Flowers bloomed with her laughter, and even the wind followed her melodies. But as her emotions deepened, so did her tones. Her anger resonated like thunder, her grief fell like rain, and her loneliness echoed into the hollows of the earth. It was said that from her most sorrowful song came the first cracks in the harmony of creation fissures, that would one day become the foundations of chaos and individuality. Where her voice trembled, the ground split. Where she wept, shadows grew. Aura's name became a warning, whispered carefully, reminding all that language was sacred and that every word had consequence. Yet despite this fear, the beings of early U did not turn away from language. They adapted. They began to treat words as gifts, sacred tools to be used with balance. Rituals emerged. Ceremonies of sound meant to cleanse or calm the vibrations of speech. Whole communities would gather at dusk to hum together in one long tone, letting their shared voices restore harmony to the world. The air after such gatherings would shimmer faintly, as though the universe itself sighed in relief. This was also when the first listeners appeared. These were beings who could hear not just the sound of words, but their essence, the truth beneath them. They were able to detect when a word was spoken with deceit, or when a tone carried pain. Legends say that their ears glowed faintly when they listened, attuned to the emotional vibrations that lingered in the air. Many sought them out for guidance, believing they could heal the dissonance left behind by careless words. The first listeners discovered something profound, that every word, once spoken, left an echo, a residue that lingered in the world. These echoes did not fade completely. They drifted, accumulating over time, forming invisible patterns in the air. Some places became saturated with the echoes of laughter, while others were heavy with unspoken grief. Even long after the speakers had vanished, their words continued to hum faintly, shaping the energy of the surroundings. Over eons, these echoes began to take form. The oldest, most powerful words, those repeated through countless generations, condensed into beings of their own. They became known as the word spirits, entities made entirely of sound and memory. Some were kind, bringing inspiration and warmth to those who heard them. Others were fragmented, born from pain, whispering confusion and fear into the hearts of those nearby. These spirits were invisible to most, but sensitive beings could feel them, especially in the quiet moments between dreams and waking. They would sense the pulse of an ancient phrase drifting through the stillness, like a heartbeat from the beginning of time. The word spirits wandered across early U, shaping destinies in subtle ways. A kind phrase murmured in the right moment could inspire courage. A bitter word could ignite conflict that lasted generations. And so the world learned reverence. Words were no longer thrown into the air without care. They were measured, weighed, and spoken with intent. The act of speaking became ritualistic, almost holy. Before major gatherings, beings would stand in silence for long stretches, attuning themselves to the rhythm of their own hearts before allowing sound to pass their lips. This was the birth of mindfulness, of understanding that sound and thought were inseparable forces. But even with all this wisdom, the pull of expression was unstoppable. For within every heart was the desire to be heard, to give shape to feeling through sound. The more language evolved, the more complex emotions became. Beings began to develop words for things that once had no name: longing, nostalgia, wonder. Each new word expanded consciousness a little further, making the world richer but also more fragile. And from this fragility came something new: the first poetry. Not practical speech, not functional communication, but pure expression. Words crafted not to describe, but to evoke. The first poets were said to speak in tones that shimmered with color, their words rippling through the air like painted light. Their poetry wasn't just art, it was a form of magic that bridged the gap between heart and cosmos. Through poetry, language became self-aware. It began to dream of itself. And as language began to dream, something truly wondrous unfolded. The world itself started to listen. The winds grew softer when spoken to gently, and the rivers shimmered in rhythm with the songs of their keepers. Trees bent closer when whispered to, and the stars above flickered in quiet reply to certain syllables carried upward in prayer. The beings of early Ooh began to notice that their words did not merely travel through air, they stayed, twining themselves into the fabric of reality. Speech became not only communication, but collaboration with existence itself. From this communion grew the earliest stories, not written, but spoken into being. Around flickering campfires or glowing stones, communities gathered to weave memory into melody. They shared tales of light and shadow, of the beings who walked before sound, and of the courage it took to speak truth into a world that once knew only silence. Each story carried with it an echo of gratitude, an acknowledgement of the fragile miracle that was language. Yet as these stories deepened, so did the complexity of meaning. No longer did words exist in isolation. They began to dance together, forming sentences that mirrored the patterns of thought and emotion. Listeners began to feel the rhythm of ideas, the way one thought could flow seamlessly into the next, just as the ocean's waves followed the pull of the moon. Some said that the formation of sentences was inspired by the very heartbeat of the world, steady, rhythmic, eternal. It was also during this era that names came into existence. Before, identity was fluid, defined by form and energy. But with words came the need to call, to recognize, to distinguish. A name was more than a sound, it was a spell. To name something was to acknowledge its essence, to anchor its being within the shared dream of reality. The first names were said to be bestowed by the word spirits themselves, whispered gently into the ears of newborn beings. These names carried power, glowing faintly in the minds of those who heard them, shaping destiny in quiet ways. There was an ancient belief that the universe itself had a name, a word so vast and sacred that speaking it aloud would cause the stars to rearrange. No one dared attempt it, though some poets claimed they could feel the word lingering in the spaces between syllables, waiting to be discovered. They believed that every act of speech, every poem, was an attempt to approach that ultimate sound, the pure name of existence. In those golden ages of expression, music blossomed fully. The rhythmic pulse of language merged with melody, giving birth to song. The first songs were simple, a few repeating tones, a soft hum, or a gentle chant carried through the night. But even in their simplicity, they held immense power. When sung together, the beings of Ooh could change the color of the sky, call rain from the clouds, or lull the earth into calm sleep. Sound became a bridge not only between souls, but between worlds. And just as sound connected, it also began to divide. Words once shared freely grew personal. Communities developed their own languages, shaped by their environment, their beliefs, and their histories. Meaning began to drift. The same word could bring comfort in one place and fear in another. With language came interpretation, and with interpretation, misunderstanding. Yet even this confusion was seen as sacred, the natural tension that came from a world awakening to its own complexity. Elder storytellers taught that each being carried a private dialect within their heart, a collection of tones known only to them and the universe. When they spoke sincerely, that dialect slipped through, coloring their words in ways no one else could replicate. It was said that love was simply the recognition of another's hidden dialect, hearing your own unspoken language reflected back through someone else's voice. As centuries turn, language became the pulse of civilization. Monuments were built to honor the first voices, temples where scholars and dreamers gathered to study the vibration of sound. They etched symbols onto stone to preserve their teachings, though they knew no carving could truly capture the essence of a word once spoken. For written language was a shadow, a reflection of a living sound. Still, they persisted, believing that even the faintest echo of truth was worth preserving. From the top of ancient towers, the priests of speech would hum at dawn, releasing tones that resonated across the valleys. These chants were believed to align the world, reminding all beings that they were part of the same great symphony. And when night fell, poets and wanderers would lie beneath the stars, whispering verses into the darkness, convinced that the universe was listening, that their words were seeds, growing unseen within the vast garden of creation. By the end of that age, silence had become a rarity. Every breeze carried whispers, every stone remembered songs. The world was alive with language not chaotic, but harmonious, a living archive of every word that had ever been spoken. The beings of Ooh had moved far from the quiet stillness of their beginnings, yet deep within them, they still carried a faint memory of that primordial hush. It waited there like the soft breath before speech, the calm that reminds every voice where it came from. And so the birth of words was not the end of silence, but its evolution, a new form of stillness, stretched thin between syllables, always reminding the world that every sound begins and ends in quiet. You've stayed with me through the birth of sound, through the first trembling voices of creation, and the poetic awakening of words themselves. Tonight we drift further into the misty corridors of memory to a time when some of those words began to fade, when the voices that once shaped reality grew quiet, and the world forgot the songs that once held it together. This part of our tale is called The Forgotten Tongues. There's a kind of sadness to the idea of forgetting language, isn't there? But it's also peaceful, in a way like the ocean reclaiming a broken shell. You see, in the ages that followed the great flowering of speech, Ooh's many beings spoke in countless languages. Each valley had its tone, each mountain its dialect. The spirits of water spoke in liquid whispers, while the roots beneath the earth communicated in slow, patient murmurs. The sky had its own tongue, too, one that only the oldest dreamers could still hear, carried on the wind's sigh. Yet as the world aged, the balance between remembering and forgetting shifted. Words that once glowed with meaning began to fade from use. Languages became smaller, simpler, less tied to the essence of the world. Some of the first words, those primal syllables that had sung the fabric of existence into being, slipped away into sleep. It was said that when the last being to speak a first word perished, that sound would not die, but drift into the folds of the world, waiting for a time when someone might need it again. This was the dawn of the forgotten tongues. They weren't lost in the way a pebble is lost in a river not gone, but transformed. The word spirits, who had once lived freely among the speaking races, began to grow faint, dissolving into the wind. The air that once hummed with the conversation began to still. Even the stars seemed quieter. Scholars from that era wrote that the silences between words started to stretch wider, like cracks appearing in old stone. And through those cracks, other sounds began to seep in faint echoes of things no one could quite name. Some ancient travelers spoke of hearing strange murmurs in places where no one else stood. Old ruins, deep beneath O, were said to whisper softly to those who listened closely, uttering fragments of languages long dead. The air around such places felt heavy, as though burdened by unspoken memories. These weren't the voices of ghosts, but the remnants of forgotten word syllables that refused to vanish, still clinging to the corners of existence. There are even stories about those who tried to remember them. They were called the Echo Keepers, wandering mystics who believed that if they listened long enough, They could draw lost languages back from the veil of silence. They would sit for days in still forests or deep within caves, meditating until they could feel the rhythm of the forgotten syllables brushing against their minds. Some claimed to have succeeded. When they spoke again, their voices carried strange harmonics, layers of meaning that no one could translate but everyone could feel. It said that a true echo keeper could heal the land with a single tone, or cause rivers to flow again by whispering the word that once named their source. But it came at a cost. Those who communed with the forgotten tongues often began to lose their own sense of identity. Their voices would shift unpredictably, sounding ancient and otherworldly one moment, fragile and human the next. Some disappeared entirely, leaving only the faint shimmer of sound behind, as if they had been absorbed by the very words they sought to awaken. In those times, began to change again. Civilizations rose, languages mixed and fractured, and the purpose of speech grew practical. Where once words had been used to shape stars and hearts, now they were used to trade, to command, to govern. The emotional music that once gave language its magic began to thin. People still spoke, but they no longer listened in the same way. The connection between sound and spirit dimmed like an ember fading to ash. Yet even in that dimming, traces of the old power lingered. In lullabies sung to newborns, in the chants of hermits on distant mountaintops, in the half-remembered proverbs of grandmothers sitting by firelight, echoes of the forgotten tongues could still be felt. They slipped into dreams and into the spaces between words, waiting for open hearts to notice them again. Some believe that these forgotten languages never truly disappeared from They simply retreated into subtler forms, into the whisper of wind through leaves, into the sighing of the sea against stone, into the pulse of the stars. The world itself became their resting place, every gust and ripple carrying the faint vibration of an ancient, unsung syllable. Those who listened carefully enough, the poets, the dreamers, the mad sometimes heard them, and wept without knowing why. That was the quiet sorrow of the age of forgetting. Not that language was gone, but that the world had grown too loud to hear it anymore. The forgetting did not come all at once. It crept in softly, like a mist over sleeping fields, so gradual that no one truly noticed until it had already taken hold. It began with the small words, the quiet, tender ones used in moments of stillness, words for feelings too gentle to measure, names for colors that no longer existed in the sky. Sounds meant only for moonlight and dreams. One by one they slipped away from memory, dissolving into the night air as if they were never meant to be held forever. With their loss, the world began to change in subtle ways. Some flowers ceased to bloom because their names were no longer spoken. Certain rivers changed course, forgetting the call that once guided their flow. The stars, it was said, grew more distant, no longer stirred by the songs that had once praised them. The beings of continued to live, to speak, to build, but something beneath the surface had grown quieter. The harmony of meaning had fractured, and though they did not yet understand why, they could feel the emptiness where the forgotten words used to dwell. Scholars of that age wrote that language is like light. It illuminates what it touches, but it also casts shadows. And when light fades, shadows grow bold. As the oldest words vanished, strange things began to happen in their absence. Silence itself became alive, filling the spaces that language had left behind. Some travelers spoke of the still zones, quiet regions where no echo could survive, and where even the most talkative creatures found their voices faltering. They said the air in those places carried weight, pressing down like unseen hands, as if the world were holding its breath. The brave, or perhaps the foolish, who ventured into these zones often returned changed. They would speak less, their voices trembling as though unsure of themselves. A few began to stutter, as if struggling to remember the rhythm of speech, but others claimed enlightenment, insisting that in the heart of silence they had heard something older than language itself, a pulse that connected all living things, something beyond sound and word. The still zones became sacred in time, revered by mystics who believed that they were the resting places of the forgotten tongues, where old words dreamed of being remembered. There are surviving inscriptions from that era carved deep into stone, written in symbols that no scholar of the later ages could fully decipher. The carvings seemed to hum faintly when touched, as though holding on to a vibration older than thought. Some believe they were written by those who tried to preserve the essence of lost language, not through words, but through resonance. The markings seemed to follow musical patterns, their curves flowing like notes on an unseen staff. It's said that under certain moonlight, they glow softly, as if remembering the voices that once shaped them. Among the oldest ruins in the land of Uru, hidden beneath centuries of growth, there are tunnels where these carvings spiral endlessly, leading to chambers filled with the scent of old air and dust. The walls there whisper faintly, not in words but in tone, a low hum that seems to vibrate in harmony with the listener's heartbeat. Those who spend too long in such places describe vivid dreams afterward, visions of ancient beings made of light and tone, mouths moving in patterns that cannot be translated, voices weaving colors across the air. Some awaken with strange words on their lips, sounds that mean nothing in modern tongues yet feel achingly familiar. These experiences gave rise to the belief that the forgotten tongues are not gone, but sleeping within memory itself. Every creature, it is said, carries a faint trace of them deep within their mind, a fragment of the first languages that once bound the world together. Some can access them through dreams, others through moments of deep silence. When someone speaks with pure intention, without fear, pride, or desire, a single syllable of the ancient tongue might surface naturally, disguised as a sigh or a hum. Many poets of later generations described this phenomenon without realizing what they were touching. They would write verses that seemed to arrive from nowhere, lines that carried more feeling than sense, as though dictated by a forgotten voice. Listeners often felt moved by such poetry in ways they couldn't explain, as if the words were brushing against something buried in their souls. Perhaps, they said, this is how the forgotten tongues survive, not through conscious speech, but through echoes that live in art, in song, in the quiet murmurings of hearts trying to remember how to speak to the world. And so even as languages shifted and cultures rose and fell, the essence of those early words lingered. Like the faint scent of rain long after the storm has passed, the memory of the first words clung to the corners of existence, waiting for someone to breathe them alive again. As the ages turned and the voices of the world grew more complex, the forgotten tongues faded deeper into the folds of history. Yet they never vanished completely. There were moments, brief, flickering instances, when their presence could still be felt. A chill in the wind that spoke without speaking. A pattern in the way fire crackled, forming rhythms that echoed across memory. To the ordinary listener, it was nothing more than coincidence. But to those who still knew how to listen with their hearts, these were reminders, the faintest breath of languages that once shaped reality. In certain corners of the traces were strongest. The ancient libraries beneath what would later become the Ice Kingdom, for instance, were once places of resonance. Before they froze under layers of eternal frost, their stone walls were inscribed with symbols meant not to be read, but to be heard. When the wind passed through the halls just right, the carvings would sing, releasing low, melodic tones that no living being could reproduce. Some historians believe these tones were fragments of one of the earliest songs ever spoken, a language used not by mortals, but by the world itself to teach the stars how to move. The wizards of that era tried to capture this sound, hoping to decode it. They built instruments of crystal and bone, tuned to the same frequencies that lingered in the air. Many recorded their findings in scrolls describing how the resonance of the forgotten tongues could bend space or soften the boundaries between dreams and waking. A few even attempted to harness these vibrations in spells, believing they could restore what time had erased. But every attempt ended the same way. The instruments shattered, and silence reclaimed the space once more. Some said the failure was not due to error, but reverence. The forgotten tongues could not be mastered, only remembered. They existed not for control, but for connection. Trying to bind them was like trying to chain the wind. They were living echoes meant to move freely, to remind the world of its origins. In later ages, when the land of O took on new shapes and the descendants of ancient beings walked its surface, faint remnants of those old words still surfaced in unlikely places. Children, half asleep, would hum melodies they had never learned. Wanderers on lonely paths would swear the rustling trees were trying to say their names. And sometimes, on nights when the stars felt unusually close, a strange harmony could be heard drifting across the fields, not a song, but a vibration, as though the world itself was softly trying to remember. There was one legend from that time that captured the imagination of countless storytellers. It spoke of the tongueless oracle, a being who dwelt in a valley where sound refused to travel. The oracle, they said, was ancient beyond measure, neither mortal nor divine, but a remnant of the era when words still shaped the fabric of existence. Those who found the valley discovered that their voices vanished upon entry. No echo, no whisper, only stillness. Yet within that silence, they would hear the oracle speak not in sound, but directly within the mind, each word vibrating like a deep, resonant truth. The oracle's gift was dangerous, for it did not offer prophecy as mortals understood it. It spoke in forgotten syllables, fragments of the languages that had long ago shaped reality. Some listeners understood none of it, but left in tears, overwhelmed by the weight of the experience. Others claimed they could understand everything, yet could never remember a single word afterward. The moment they stepped out of the valley, the memory of the oracle's voice vanished, leaving behind only a lingering feeling, a kind of peace tinged with melancholy. Many believed that the oracle was not a being at all, but a convergence of the forgotten tongues themselves, a living echo of the first age of sound. In that quiet valley, the remnants of old words found harmony again, forming a consciousness born purely of memory. If true, then the oracle was proof that language itself had a soul, that words, no matter how lost, would always strive to find form once more. Even after this legend faded into myth, the belief that words carried spiritual weight endured. Some small communities in the distant corners of U developed rituals to honor the memory of lost languages. They would gather at twilight, holding candles and humming softly, creating tones that vibrated in unison. The practice was called the remembering. Participants didn't speak a single word during the ritual. They simply let their hearts guide their breathing, allowing the silence between them to fill with unseen echoes. Those who took part often described feeling surrounded by unseen presences, gentle and curious, as though the air itself leaned closer to listen. When the ritual ended, participants felt lighter, as if a part of their souls had been quietly cleansed. Some even reported dreams afterward of ancient landscapes glowing with unfamiliar symbols, of voices singing in languages that no longer existed, of warmth and sorrow intertwined. They would wake with tears on their cheeks, and a sense that something beautiful had brushed against them and moved on. Over time, these rituals became rare, then forgotten altogether. But every so often, a new generation stumbled upon them again, rediscovering the same melodies by instinct alone. The world, it seemed, had a way of remembering even what had been forgotten. And so the ages turned again, and Oo shifted into yet another dream of itself. Kingdoms rose, fell, and turned to dust. Yet faint traces of the old tongues remained hidden in the corners of existence, like forgotten melodies that could still be heard if one listened in just the right way. Though the languages of that era had become fragmented, some fragments refused to die. They found ways to live through other means in symbols, gestures, and in the subtle hum of the living world itself. There were stories told by forest spirits that certain plants still remembered the first words ever spoken to them. If you stood beneath their leaves at dusk and remained perfectly still, you could sometimes hear a gentle vibration rising from the roots. Not a sound exactly, but a sensation, like the faint memory of a song long since ended. They said that trees never truly forgot, that the syllables of their first names still echoed deep within their trunks. Those names were not meant for mortal mouths anymore, yet the world seemed to hum in gratitude whenever anyone tried to speak them, even clumsily. The animals, too, carried fragments of those early sounds. The call of the morning birds, the song of the whales beneath the sea, the rustling of unseen wings in the forest canopy, all of it was part of the world's memory of its first language. Some scholars in later ages claimed that animals had never stopped speaking the ancient tongues. It was humanity that had lost the ability to hear them. In this belief, every howl, chirp, or hiss was not random, but sacred, a continuation of the first music of creation. Those who listened closely enough might learn something deeper than knowledge, something closer to communion. Even the elements held memory. Fire flickered in rhythmic patterns, as if reciting forgotten mantras. Rivers formed whirlpools where the current's whispers seemed almost articulate. Lightning, flashing across the sky, carried the quick, sharp cadence of words too old to be contained. For those few with ears attuned to the resonance of existence, it was clear that the forgotten tongues were not truly gone. They had simply shifted into a new form of expression, one that no longer required the human voice. But among mortals, very few could still sense it. As new empires rose and technology grew, the air filled with new kinds of noise, chatter, laughter, argument, and industry. The hum of creation became muffled beneath layers of modern sound. Yet even then there were always a few who heard differently. Dreamers, wanderers, and strange children who spoke in their sleep. Some of them were said to mutter phrases in unknown languages, words that caused candles to flicker or water to ripple without wind. Parents would hush them gently, thinking it nonsense. But those who truly listened felt the air change when the words were spoken, as though something ancient stirred in recognition. These children were called whisper-born by the few who believed in such things, descendants of those who once communed with the echo keepers or the oracle. They were thought to carry fragments of the forgotten tongues in their souls, unconsciously repeating syllables that the world still remembered. Most grew up and forgot, their strange speech fading into memory, but a few retained the ability to hear the silent voices of nature. They would wander far from villages, standing for hours beside the rivers or beneath stars, listening to what others could not. One such whisper-born was said to have lived near the ruins of an old tower, in what later became the Candy Kingdom. Her name has been lost, but her legend remained. They say she never spoke aloud, yet flowers bloomed wherever she walked. She communicated through humming, a deep tone that vibrated through the earth like a quiet heartbeat. Travelers claimed that when they slept near her home, they dreamt in languages they didn't understand but somehow felt. It was as if the world itself, through her, was still trying to remember what it once knew. And perhaps it always would. Because even when words fade, the longing for meaning remains. The forgotten tongues were more than just lost languages. They were expressions of a deeper truth that every sound, every whisper, is a part of something larger, something eternal. They taught that the world itself is not mute, but dreaming, and every living thing is a note in its great, unfinished song. In time, when the surface of Oo would shift again, when ice would rise, when kingdoms would crumble, when new voices would be born from the ruins, traces of the forgotten tongues would still drift quietly beneath it all, in lullabies sung without knowing why, in dreams shared between strangers, in the hush that falls before a storm, their echoes would return. And maybe in those moments when the world grows still, when you pause between words, when you listen without trying, you can feel them too. The hum of the oldest stories, the memory of the first voices, the language that once held everything together. It's there, just beneath the surface of things, waiting, not to be spoken, but to be remembered. If you're still awake, still wrapped in your blanket, and floating gently on the edges of dream, we're about to step into another layer of the old world, the Age of Echoes. This was not a time of silence like before, nor a time of speech as we know it now. It was something in between, a twilight era where the world itself remembered the sound of its own voice, but no longer knew how to use it. The people of Oo, the spirits, even the very air, existed within a strange resonance, a time where everything that was said lingered, repeating softly, shaping the land and those who lived upon it. It is said that in the age of echoes, every sound carried a memory. A simple word spoken once could ripple through valleys and canyons for generations, returning faintly each year like a ghost revisiting its favorite place. Villages would hear old songs drifting through their streets at dawn, songs whose singers had long turned to dust. Travelers crossing the plains might hear their own voices call their names from far away, even when no one else was near. It was a haunting time, but not a cruel one. The echoes were gentle, wistful, almost longing, as though the world itself was trying to remind its children of what had been forgotten. The scholars of that era, the ones who still studied the remnants of language, believed that the Age of Echoes began when sound itself became too heavy with memory. Every word carried meaning that had once been power, and when those meanings were lost or misused, the sounds began to drift without anchor. Like balloons untethered, they floated into the air and stayed there, waiting to be found again. And when the wind was right, they would return, whispering through the canyons and caverns, through the shells of old temples, through the rib cages of sleeping beasts, long extinct. There was beauty in this haunting, but also sorrow. Imagine a world where the past never truly leaves, where even the quietest confession, the gentlest song, continues to circle back to you across the years. Many of the people who lived then grew used to the echoes, even comforted by them. For some, it was a way to stay connected with their ancestors. They would stand in special caves and speak their loved ones' names aloud, then wait for the faint, returning murmur that would carry the voice of the past back to them. They believed that each echo was a soul gently calling home. But for others, it became a kind of burden. The air was never truly still. Every silence had a heartbeat beneath it. Every breeze carried a whisper that didn't belong to the present moment. There were stories of those who tried to live in complete quiet, hiding their voices, sealing their homes with layers of soft moss and cloth so that not a single word could escape. They feared that their own echoes might turn against them, that what they said might come back twisted, warped by time, no longer their own. The most mysterious accounts tell of places known as the echo wells, deep natural hollows scattered across the wilderness, where sound behaved differently. These wells were said to lead into the very heart of the world's memory. If one spoke a word into an echo well, it would return not once, but endlessly, cycling in strange variations, as if the world itself was responding. Many seekers traveled far to find these places. Some sought to hear divine voices, others to rediscover ancient languages. A few simply wanted to hear someone they had lost. There are songs from the old tribes describing one such well deep in the land of dust and shadow, where a young girl once whispered her mother's name and heard it, answered not by her own echo, but by a soft, unfamiliar voice that thanked her for remembering. She fled, frightened but also comforted, believing that the earth itself had spoken. That story became part of local myth, and to this day, the whisper of the wind through deep ravines in that region is said to sound like a mother calling her child home. What's fascinating about this age is how language itself began to change again, shaped by its own reflection. People started to speak in softer tones, choosing words with care, knowing that everything they said would come back to them. The reckless noise of youth and power faded. Instead, a society grew quieter, more contemplative. Conversations were poetic, slow, and full of pauses, not because people had nothing to say, but because they were listening for their own echoes. They wanted to hear how their words would sound when returned by the world. The bards of that era, those who sang for the scattered villages, were not just storytellers, but listeners. They would travel for weeks between settlements, collecting echoes that had drifted across lands. Some of them carried small glass jars, believing they could capture the faintest tones and preserve them. They said that if you held such a jar to your ear on a quiet night, you could hear not just a sound, but a story, a moment, from someone's life, caught in the resonance of time. Those who still remember the bards say that their songs were unlike anything heard before or since. They did not follow melody in the usual way, but flowed like rivers, rippling, returning, folding back on themselves. Each verse seemed to contain an echo of the last, as though the music were alive, constantly revisiting its own memory. Some believed the bards were the last beings who truly understood how to speak with the world, not at it. Their voices carried an ancient patience, a rhythm that made the air shimmer, and the stones tremble softly in reply. Among these wanderers, there was one name that lingered in half-remembered stories, Elo of the Quiet Strings. It was said that Elo traveled the land with a small harp made of bone and silver, strung with threads spun from her own hair. Wherever she went, the echoes followed her like gentle ghosts. When she played, mountains seemed to hum in distant harmony, and old ruins would respond with faint harmonic tones. People called her the Keeper of Echoes, believing that she could speak to the lingering voices of ages past and soothe them into rest. According to one legend, Elo once journeyed into the Sea of Glass, a vast desert of crystalline sand where the wind itself sang. Each grain was said to be the memory of a sound long gone, frozen into crystal form. When the wind swept across the dunes, it created a soft, haunting chorus that filled the air for miles. Elo set up camp there and played her harp for 7 nights. On the final night, the wind grew still, and the song of the sand became quiet. The next morning, travelers found her harp half buried, glowing faintly with a silvery light, but Elo herself had vanished. Some said she had become one with the echoes, that her voice had finally blended into the world's memory, where she would continue singing forever. This story, whether true or not, reflected the reverence that the people of U held for echoes. They did not fear them as much as they once had. Over time, the echoes came to be seen not as ghosts or burdens, but as reminders, gentle reflections that taught patience and mindfulness. Every sound, they believed, had a consequence. To speak was to send part of yourself into eternity, knowing it would someday find its way back. The people of that era learned to live as if each word was sacred, each silence equally so. Yet the deeper magic of echoes ran further than anyone truly understood. The scholars of the Crystal Spire, one of the last great centers of knowledge before the modern age of U began to experiment with sound as a form of energy. They discovered that echoes were not just reflections of air and vibration, but repositories of power. The longer a sound lingered, the more influence it gathered. A chant repeated over years could reshape the stone walls of their halls, carving strange symbols into their surfaces without tools. A simple hum, maintained by monks for a decade, caused the floors to glow faintly into the dark. From this, they developed the study known as resonant thaumaturgy, the art of harnessing echoes as magic. Instead of relying on written spells, these early sound mages used tone, rhythm, and breaths to command reality. Some could call fire with a single word sung in perfect pitch. Others could heal wounds through low, sustained vibration. The practice required immense discipline, for an incorrectly spoken tone could twist upon itself and create discord and echo that would linger painfully, haunting its speaker for years. The oldest surviving fragments of their writings describe a concept they called the returning sound, an echo so ancient that it predated all speech. They believed it was the voice of the world itself, the primal hum that still lived beneath creation. Those who sought it claimed that to hear it was to understand everything, but none who truly heard it ever returned unchanged. The mind, they warned, was not meant to hold that kind of resonance. It would vibrate itself apart, dispersing into the same hum that created it. Still, many tried. It's said that the monks of the northern caverns once came close. They spent generations chanting a single tone in perfect unison, their voices merging until individual identity dissolved. When their experiment reached its peak, travelers reported that the mountains around the monastery began to sing back, low and mournful, but beautiful beyond words. Then one night, the entire monastery went silent. Only the faint hum of the wind remained, but it carried within it a strange warmth, as though the monks had become the sound they sought. To those who came after, this era was remembered as both wondrous and melancholy. The Age of Echoes taught U that sound was more than a tool of communication. It was a living bridge between past and present, between mortal and divine. But it also reminded them of the fragility of such power. The more they listened, the more they realized that echoes carried not only beauty, but the weight of all that had ever been said, felt, or sung. Every whisper was eternal, and eternity, when heard too closely, could be overwhelming. As the Age of Echoes deepened, the line between memory and sound grew so thin that even silence began to shimmer with presence. The people of U started to notice that their dreams were no longer purely their own. When they drifted to sleep, they could sometimes hear faint voices carried through their slumber, old songs, forgotten prayers, or quiet laughter that belonged to someone from centuries ago. The echoes had begun to inhabit not just the air, but the subconscious. They threaded themselves through the fabric of thought, like the lingering scent of something familiar that could never quite be placed. In small towns nestled near ancient ruins, entire communities developed rituals to honor these voices. Each year, at the turning of seasons, they would gather at dusk and release their words into the night. They would speak not to each other, but to the wind, offering messages of gratitude, sorrow, and remembrance. Then they would fall silent, listening for whatever the world might choose to return. Sometimes it was only a sigh of breeze. Sometimes it was the faint repetition of a child's laughter or the echo of a long-vanished name. To them, it was proof that existence was cyclical, that nothing ever truly disappeared. Every sound, every heartbeat, was a note in the eternal composition mood. The old ruins themselves seemed alive during this time. The stones that had witnessed the dawn of sound carried the hum of history within them. Some walls could still speak if one knew how to listen. There were tales of explorers who pressed their ears to the foundations of ancient temples and heard soft chanting, like monks reciting from beneath the earth. Others claimed that deep in the mountains, where frost never melted, there were frozen echoes trapped in the ice, perfectly preserved voices from the earliest days. When the sun touched them, the air would vibrate faintly, releasing the tone of the world's first language into the wind. But not all echoes were kind. Over time, some began to lose their clarity. As the centuries passed, the words of the past became distorted, frayed by repetition. A sentence spoken with love could return anger. A song of joy could twist into lament. The people of U came to understand that echoes, like memories, were vulnerable to change. They reflected not only what was said, but how the world had shifted since it was spoken. Just as light bends when passing through water, sound, too, could warp through time. This gave rise to a quiet superstition that one should never speak in hatred, for the echo would someday return with greater force. There were stories told by the fireside of kings who cursed their enemies, only to be driven mad years later by the sound of their own fury whispering in their sleep. Some said that the echoes were merely physics. Others swore they were the conscience of the world itself, teaching balance to those who forgot. Whatever the truth, the people grew gentler. Speech became sacred again, not because of fear, but because they had learned how deeply the world remembered. It was around this time that the mysterious Echo Archives were founded, hidden beneath what would one day become the plains of U. This vast underground labyrinth was said to hold recordings of every sound the planet had ever heard. The walls were formed from resonant crystal that absorbed vibration, preserving it indefinitely. Only the most devoted of scholars were permitted to enter, for the archives were dangerous not physically, but spiritually. Within those halls, echoes could awaken and speak. Some scholars went mad listening to the overlapping voices of ages. Others disappeared, lured deeper by the promise of hearing the original tones of creation. In one account, a monk known as Irel ventured into the deepest chamber of the archives and heard something impossible, her own voice, singing a lullaby she had never known. She followed it until the sound surrounded her completely like a warm mist. When her fellow monks found her days later, she was sitting in stillness, eyes closed, humming softly in harmony with the chamber itself. She said she understood now that time was not a line but a spiral, that every voice ever spoken was still speaking, only at different distances from the center. Then she smiled, and her body turned to crystal, her form forever humming a quiet tone. The chamber where she sat is said to still sing faintly to this day. The age of echoes became both a comfort and a riddle. It reminded the world that even when forgotten, all things are connected. The smallest sound could reach eternity. But it also whispered a warning that too much reflection can trap a soul in the loop of its own voice. And so balance became the great pursuit of that age. How to speak without clinging to the echo. How to listen without losing oneself in the song of what has already passed. From the quiet mountains to the deep forests, this wisdom spread like soft rain. People began to speak less and listen more. They learned to hear not only with their ears, but with their hearts, their dreams, and their silences. And in doing so, they realized something profound, that sometimes the most powerful echoes are not those that return to us, but those that ripple outward, touching others in ways we will never hear. As the age of echoes drew toward its gentle twilight, the world of Ooh found itself humming in a rare balance. The air was never entirely silent, yet it was peaceful, filled with a low, steady resonance that felt like the heartbeat of creation itself. Villages were quieter than before, not from fear or sorrow, but from reverence. Words were used sparingly, sung softly, as though the speakers were aware that the earth itself was listening. The people no longer sought to master the echoes or to silence them. Instead, they lived alongside them, accepting that their voices were part of a far older rhythm than any one life could contain. It is said that during this time, even the stars began to sing faintly again, not in the sense of audible music, but through light flickering with patterns that scholars recognized as harmonics. They believed it was the same song that once echoed in the void before the first words were spoken, now returning through the sky as a reminder that creation itself was still unfolding. Observers of the night claimed that when they closed their eyes and breathed slowly beneath the stars, they could feel those vibrations moving through their bones, a soundless hymn that connected every living thing. From this harmony grew a new philosophy, one that would shape the mystical traditions of Ooh for centuries to come. It was known simply as the listening way. It taught that true understanding comes not from speaking, but from receiving. That sound was a bridge, not a weapon, and that to live in harmony with the world's memory was to become a vessel for it. Those who followed the listening way would often spend years in solitude, dwelling in places of deep resonance, caves, hollowed trees, mountainsides, or beneath lakes where echoes swam like fish. They sought not enlightenment through silence, but communion through stillness. Many of these practitioners described strange experiences during their meditations. They claimed to hear the voices of those who had come before them, not as words, but as feelings, tones, and breaths. Some reported that even the stones beneath them seemed to sigh with relief when they listened long enough. A few believed that if one reached a perfect state of listening, the boundary between self and sound would dissolve entirely, and the listener would merge with the great chorus of existence. They would become what the ancients called anima resona, the living echo. Legends say that only one person ever achieved this fully. She was known simply as Sora, a humble musician who played a flute carved from the branch of the world's oldest tree. Her music was so tender, so patient, that the echoes refused to fade. For years she traveled across O, playing for empty fields, for rivers, for crumbling ruins. She believed that every place deserved to be reminded of its own song. When she grew old, she returned to a quiet glade and played one final melody beneath the silver light of the moon. Those who passed by afterward said the sound never stopped, that even after her body returned to the earth, the forest continued to breathe her song. Travelers who rest beneath those trees sometimes wake to find the air humming softly around them, as though the world itself were whispering lullabies in Sora's voice. In the centuries that followed, her story became a symbol of the age of echoes, a reminder that every sound, no matter how small, carries the essence of its creator. The echoes that lingered in the world were no longer feared as ghosts or worshipped as gods. They were seen as the soft reminders of connection, threads that bound past and present in a single continuum. And as the echoes faded further into memory, something unexpected began to occur. The world grew quiet again, but not in the same way it had before. This silence was not empty. It was full, vibrant, alive with potential. It was the silence before creation once more, the deep, collective breath the universe takes before speaking anew. The people of Ooh began to sense that something was shifting. The echoes were not ending. They were preparing. They had circled long enough, gathered enough meaning, enough emotion, enough remembrance. The world was ready to speak again, to form new words born from the resonance of everything that had ever been said. And so the age of echoes came to a close as softly as it began. The songs of the old bards faded into the wind, the hum of the mountains grew still, and the whispering caves quieted. Yet the memory of that age lived on in every lullaby, in every hush before dawn, in every moment when the world feels as though it is listening back. The echoes had taught Ooh how to hear again, how to understand that sound is sacred, not because it endures, but because it connects. And in that understanding, a new dawn began to stir, one where the world would remember its voice once more, not as a reflection, but as something reborn. The next age would not be ruled by silence or echo, but by something far more profound, the harmony between them, the voice of a world finally ready to sing again. When the echoes finally faded, what followed was not silence in the way one might imagine, but a gentle, endless pause, a breath held by the world itself. The age of echoes had come to rest, and from that stillness, something new began to bloom. This was the dawn of what the old mystics would one day call the word beyond words, a time when speech transcended sound, when meaning itself began to take shape in ways that language could no longer contain. In the early days of this age, the world of Ooh seemed softer, slower, almost dreamlike. The air shimmered faintly, as though the remnants of the echoes still lingered, but they were no longer restless. They had folded inward, merging with the breath of every living thing. Speech had become sacred once again, yet most communication no longer required words at all. It was as if the essence of language, the bridge between thought and reality, had finally completed its long journey and returned to its source. The people who lived through this transformation did not fully understand it at first. They simply noticed that when they sat in stillness together, ideas passed between them without the need for speech. A feeling, a thought, or an image could drift from one mind to another like the gentle passing of light through glass. They began to call this new form of communion true speaking. It was the purest form of connection, not shaped by sound, but carried by intention. The elders of that age believed this was the culmination of all that had come before. Every silence, every vibration, every echo had been leading toward this, a way of understanding that existed beyond the boundaries of tongue and tone. The word beyond words was not a word at all, but the living heartbeat of meaning itself. It was as if the world had spent millennia teaching itself how to listen, and now, at last, it could speak from within. Those who practiced true speaking said it felt like singing without sound, or dreaming while awake. When they wished to share something, they didn't form sentences, they breathed slowly, allowing the feeling to rise through them like wind through trees. The listener would feel the meaning settle within them, not as information, but as recognition. It wasn't about exchanging ideas, but remembering something they already knew. The entire world seemed to participate in this harmony. Trees leaned closer, rivers brightened, even clouds shifted their shapes in time with thought. There were stories of two travelers who met upon a mountain path, both strangers, both silent. They sat beside each other, gazing at the sky, and by the time the stars rose, they had shared entire lifetimes in understanding. They parted without speaking a single word, yet both knew they would remember the other forever. In this new age, love, sorrow, and wonder were no longer bound by sound. They flowed freely through the fabric of existence. The mystics believed this was the language spoken by the cosmos itself, the same current that shaped stars, that whispered life into the first living cell. They said it was the purest form of creation, a resonance so complete that it required no vibration to exist. In this belief, the universe was not a place filled with meaning, but made of it. The word beyond words was the structure of reality itself, the thought of existence, dreaming itself awake. And yet, for all its beauty, this age carried an eerie calm. There were no arguments, no misunderstandings, no need for persuasion or deception. Every being lived in complete transparency, unable to hide their inner state, for it resonated naturally into the world around them. It was peace, yes, but it was also exposure. Some began to wonder whether this perfect harmony was truly living or merely existing, for in understanding all things completely, mystery began to fade, and with it, the thrill of discovery that once drove creation forward. Among the few who questioned this perfection were the last remnants of the sound weavers, descendants of those who had once studied the magic of resonance. They gathered in the hidden valleys and beneath the old temples, speaking quietly in forgotten languages, trying to remember what it felt like to not understand, to reach for something beyond their grasp. They believed that the world's heart was growing too still, that without contrast, even harmony could lose its song. Their leader, a woman named Lisa, spoke the final words ever recorded in the tongue of the Echo Ages. No one knew what they meant, but the moment she spoke them, the wind changed. The trees began to sway, and the rivers shivered as though remembering motion. It was said that her final act reintroduced imperfection into the world, not as a flaw, but as a gift. Because in that small disruption, the cycle began anew. The world remembered that sound and silence were never enemies. They were lovers, destined to chase one another through eternity, creating everything that ever was. As the ripples of Lisa's final words spread across something stirred within the stillness. The calm that had reigned for so long began to breathe again. At first it was subtle, a rustle of leaves that didn't match the wind, a hum that came from nowhere but echoed in the bones of every living thing. It wasn't the chaos of the past returning, but a gentle pulse of difference, a reminder that even in unity there must be movement. The age of the word beyond words began to evolve slowly and beautifully into something more alive. The beings of who had grown accustomed to the quiet communion of thought, began to feel emotions that had long lain dormant. They felt curiosity again, that soft ache of wanting to know what lay just beyond their reach. They felt the flicker of surprise, of wonder, even of doubt. And with those feelings came something the world hadn't heard in what felt like centuries, laughter. It was awkward at first, unsteady and strange, but it carried a spark unlike anything the silent age could offer. The true speakers realized that the act of not knowing was a kind of beauty in itself. They had spent ages basking in complete understanding, where meaning flowed without error. But now, for the first time in forever, they tasted the sweetness of mystery. They began to tell stories again, not because they needed to share knowledge, but because they wanted to imagine. The storytellers of this new dawn mixed silence with sound, merging true speaking with old words to create something halfway between mind and melody. It was in this time that the idea of living language returned words not as tools but as art. The sound weavers' descendants began to craft songs made of both vibration and thought, harmonies that reached beyond the ear and touched the soul directly. A listener could hear the tone, yet feel the meaning bloom inside their chest. These compositions were unlike anything the world had ever known. They were both audible and invisible, finite and infinite. The rivers seemed to sing along to them. The air shimmered faintly when they played, and ancient stones hummed in recognition. Some said the music woke the dreams of the planet itself, that mountains turned in their long sleep and whispered back. Every living thing seemed to remember something it had forgotten, that creation was never meant to be perfect, only alive. Lisa's followers believed she had not destroyed the harmony of the word beyond words, but deepened it, giving it room to breathe. In her final act, she had reunited silence and sound, meaning and mystery. The world was whole again, not a flawless crystal, but a living heart, pulsing with contradictions. And from this living heart came a new form of connection, one that combined the best of all ages before it. In the great cities that rose once more, you could find people communicating in dazzling new ways. Some spoke softly, weaving intent through tone. Others closed their eyes, sharing feelings directly through the hum of their being. Poets began to sculpt meaning in layers, a spoken phrase that shimmered with thought beneath it, a gesture that rippled across both mind and air. It was a dance between seen and unseen, sound and silence, like two mirrors facing each other into eternity. In the evenings, when the stars appeared, groups gathered around the glowing stone, said to still hold echoes of the first vibrations. There they sang together, not to perform, but to remember. Each song began as a whisper, then grew until the sky itself seemed to hum in answer. The constellations pulsed faintly, responding to the resonance below. In those moments, the boundary between thought and universe vanished entirely. The people of O were not simply speaking to the stars. They were speaking as them. It was during one of these gatherings that a child, nameless in the records, faceless in memory, asked a question that would ripple through all that followed. If meaning can be felt without words, then why do words still exist? The crowd fell silent, their minds brushing against one another as they searched for an answer. Finally, an elder smiled and said, "Because words are how the universe plays." That phrase spread across Oo like sunlight breaking through fog. It became a kind of philosophy, a celebration of imperfection. Words were no longer seen as barriers between minds, but as games, sacred toys the universe used to explore itself. Each sentence, each song, each laugh was a way for reality to stretch its imagination. In this way, the word beyond words became not an end, but a doorway, an invitation for creation to keep unfolding forever. As that understanding settled into the hearts of Oo's people, the world seemed to exhale. For so long, words had been chased, hunted for meaning, feared for power, revered for perfection. But now, they were simply allowed to be. Language became like water again, flowing freely through every form of life, shaping itself to the vessel that held it. Children sang nonsense melodies under starlight, not to summon magic or preserve history, but because it felt good to let sound exist. Golems etched symbols into the dust, just to watch the wind erase them. Even the spirits of the forest, who once guarded silence as a holy thing, began to hum. Oh, there was a new softness to the world. The mountains still remembered their ancient songs, but now they sang them quietly, almost shyly, to those who would listen. The rivers murmured their stories as they passed through stone, and the air carried tiny phrases between valleys like secret gifts. It was as though Oo had begun to dream aloud again, whispering fragments of the cosmos through every leaf and current. The scholars of this era called it the time of gentle tongues. They studied how sound and thought intertwined, how each tone carried an emotional current that words alone could never contain. They realized that even the simplest phrase was more than its letters. It was a vibration through space, a pattern that could ripple across the living field of the universe. They began to believe that sound itself might be the handwriting of creation. One particular scholar, an old turtle named Rome, devoted his centuries-long life to studying the echoes left in the oldest corners of Oo. He wandered deep into forgotten ruins and found walls that sang faintly when touched, like glass resonating to a distant note. When he placed his ear against them, he claimed to hear the original languages of the world still vibrating, trapped in the stone. Not as words, but as memory. He said they weren't waiting to be deciphered. They were simply waiting to be heard. Rome became a quiet figure of myth himself, known as the listener beneath the world. Some say that on the night he disappeared, he found the final chord, the one that tied all sounds together. Others believe he became part of that chord, his consciousness blending with the hum of the planet. And sometimes when the wind moves through old ruins or through hollow trees, travelers swear they can hear a low, kind voice murmuring beneath the air. They say it sounds like the world thinking to itself. In this age, songs and speech were no longer separate things. They merged into a kind of living poetry, each phrase carrying multiple layers of meaning, each silence filled with intent. The artists of Oo would gather in moonlit fields, their voices rising and falling like tides. Some spoke in riddles that shimmered like crystal, others in tones so low they felt like the heartbeat of the earth. No two performances were ever the same, for each depended on the unseen harmonies between speaker, listener, and night. Those who experienced these gatherings often described them as dreams one could walk through, awake. They would leave feeling as if they had forgotten something important, and in that forgetting, found peace. For the people of Oo had come to accept that not every word was meant to be understood. Some were meant only to be felt, to pass through you like a breeze, leaving behind a shape of meaning too large to grasp. From this acceptance grew a quiet wisdom, that silence and speech were not opposites, but companions. Each gave the other purpose. The true power of language was not in speaking constantly, but in knowing when to let the world speak through you. And when the people of Oo began to live by this rhythm, the very air of the world changed. The sky seemed brighter, the stars closer. The space between moments stretched a little wider, allowing time to breathe. Even the cosmic beings, the timeless watchers beyond reality's veil, took notice. Some say Prismo's cube shimmered differently, as if smiling its own quiet way. The cosmic entities who once built the structure of existence began to weave softer threads into the multiverse's design threads that pulsed not with logic, but with feeling. The universe itself began to hum again, faint but steady, like a lullaby sung to no one and everyone at once. And so Oo entered a new kind of stillness, not the empty quiet of the first age, but the peaceful silence that follows understanding. It was the pause between heartbeats, the calm between songs. The world had learned to speak and to stop speaking, to create and to rest. And in that delicate balance, it found something profound. The truth that the greatest word of all was not spoken or thought, but lived. For in every moment of kindness, in every act of creation, in every gentle glance between beings who understood each other without sound, the word beyond words continued to sing. Not from mouths or minds, but from the very pulse of existence itself. It was no longer something to be heard, but something to be felt, a quiet vibration that reminded every being, great and small, that they were part of the same eternal sentence, still being written across the fabric of the stars. And so the word beyond words became the heartbeat of Oo itself. It was not confined to any tongue or symbol now, not trapped in scrolls or carved into stone. It lived in the rhythm of life, in the sigh of the wind, in the laughter of water as it met rock, in the soft rustle of leaves greeting the dawn. Every sound was sacred, yet ordinary. Every silence was full, yet light. The people of U no longer sought to master language, for they had learned that to speak perfectly was to silence discovery. Instead, they embraced imperfection as the truest expression of being alive. They began to say that the universe speaks through its mistakes. When a word is misheard, when a thought comes out clumsy or strange, the world is simply trying a new sound. To err was not to fail, it was to participate in creation. So storytellers told their tales slowly, leaving the room for quiet between sentences. Musicians allowed pauses that hung long enough for listeners to breathe with them. Even wizards, who once pursued precise incantations, began to weave small hesitations into their spells, trusting that the universe would fill in what they could not. There was beauty in that surrender. U glowed with a softer kind of magic now, one born not from control, but from faith. Faith that meaning did not need to be perfect to be true. Faith that even silence could be a sentence in the universe's story. As the centuries drifted on, this understanding settled deep into the soil. It became the instinct of the land itself, the way light curved through the trees, the way clouds seemed to listen to the mountains. The very air carried the hum of that eternal conversation, still unfolding word by word, breath by breath. Somewhere, in a quiet corner of the Candy Kingdom, a young scholar once asked an elder, "What was the first word ever spoken?" The elder smiled, dipping a quill into ink that shimmered like moonlight. "The first word," they said, "was not a word at all. It was the moment the universe decided to listen." Those words would echo across generations. They reminded the people that sound and silence were never enemies. That language, in its truest form, was simply listening not only to others, but to the heartbeat beneath all things. And so, even in times of chaos or rebuilding, that calm understanding lingered. Cities could rise and fall, empires could crumble into dust. But somewhere, the wind would always whisper, and someone would always hear it. Etat. When night fell upon U, the songs of the living and the dreams of the past intertwined. The stars above seemed to sway in rhythm with the hum below, as though the entire sky were leaning down to listen. Some nights, the glow of the constellations would pulse faintly, responding to voices that no mortal could hear. The universe, it seemed, was still speaking softly to itself, still testing new words, still breathing meaning into its endless story. In the stillness of such nights, if you walked alone through the meadows outside the tree fort, you might hear faint echoes carried by the grass. Not words, not even sound, but a feeling, a vibration that brushed against your chest, warm and steady. It was the same pulse that had always been there, the one that had existed before speech, before sound, before even light. The memory of the first vibration. The whisper of creation's beginning and its promise to never truly end. And if you listened closely enough, letting your mind quiet and your breath slow, you might feel it too, that invisible music that ties everything together. It doesn't need a name. It doesn't need to be understood. It only needs to be felt. For in that feeling lies the truth that every being in U, from the tiniest seed to the oldest star, is part of one unbroken sentence, a single thought, that the cosmos is still gently speaking. So when the last candle flickers low and the night deepens, the people of U do not pray, nor chant, nor seek answers in ancient tomes. They simply sit in silence and listen. The forests hum, the rivers murmur, the stars whisper back. And in that communion, that perfect balance of sound and stillness, the world finds its peace again. That is the age we live in now, the age where words have transcended their shapes, where meaning floats freely through all things, the age beyond words, a time not of power or prophecy, but of gentle awareness, the quiet understanding that everything in its own way is always speaking. So as you rest tonight, think of that first breath of the universe, the moment before the first sound, the stillness before creation found its voice. That silence wasn't empty, it was waiting, it was listening. And in your own heartbeat, the same silence still waits, still listens, still sings. Good night.